Hello, I'm Dan Tillapaugh, and you can use he, him, his pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of counselor education at California Lutheran University. Today we have a terrific group of educational scholars who will be sharing their thoughts with us on mixed methods research. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a minute, but before they do, I want to send a shout out to Dr. Chris Linder from the University of Georgia, who inspired this idea of recorded panel conversations about educational research. I also want to thank my collaborator on this series, Dr. Jessica Harris from UCLA, who helped prepare the questions for today's panel, but is not able to join us. Today's panelists will be discussing their experiences as researchers engaged in mixed methods research in educational contexts. Their work is interesting and compelling, and I'm so pleased that they'll be able to share their insights with you today. At this point, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly with their name, gender pronouns, a little bit about yourself and what you do as a researcher. And maybe Kim, do you want to go first?
Of course you choose me first. Hi, everybody. My name is Kimberly Griffin. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm an associate professor at the University of Maryland. I'm in the Higher Education, Student Affairs, and International Education program, and my area of concentration is student affairs. I consider myself broadly an access and equity researcher, so I've studied everything from Black faculty to Black immigrant college students to student veterans. I spend most of my time these days thinking about faculty diversity issues and how to increase faculty diversity in a very longitudinal sense. So what are we doing in graduate education in terms of career development? How are we thinking about graduate admissions? How are we thinking about how we socialize people towards and away from the academy? And how we think about retention once folks have actually reached their positions. Let's see, when I'm not working, I love yoga, and I recently started gardening, and I just planted my first garden, so I'm super excited about it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Gina Garcia. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh. I am in the Department of Administrative and Policy Studies, and I am in the Higher Education Management program. Let's see, my research broadly is equity and diversity. I'm an organizational theorist, so I study higher education at an organizational level, looking at, specifically right now, spending most of my time looking at Hispanic serving institutions, which are institutions that enroll at least 25% or more Latino students. And I spent a lot of time thinking, just what does that actually mean? A lot of meaning making around the identity, beyond just 25%, because 25% doesn't mean much, right? It just means that the institution enrolls a lot of diverse students. So what does it mean beyond that for people? How do they make sense of that label? Beyond that, what do we say? The things we like to do. I love to run. I also like yoga. Yoga is good for the mind and the soul and the body. And I have 2 children, so they keep me very busy. Two small children, 4 and 7. So.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks again for being here. The first question, I think, sometimes might be the hardest. So how would you explain mixed methods research to a student who may not be familiar with what that is? Maybe, Gina, if you don't mind starting us off.
Okay. So mixed methods, I think I got to a point recently where I realized that to compartmentalize methods, I think is problematic, and I think we tend to do that, right? Particularly in graduate training programs. There are programs that are known to do certain types of research, right? Like that program's quantitative, and that one's qualitative, and people that come out of that program do quasi-experimental work, right? Like labeling the programs even, right? And then within the programs, people as well, right? Like so-and-so does this work and so-and-so does that work. As opposed to just thinking like, you know what, there's a lot of ways to answer questions, right? And we can answer the same question from lots of different approaches. And so there isn't exactly one way, and I don't think there has to be one type when you're a person, right? Like that as a researcher. And so I think about mixed methods as I've been thinking about it actually in a Gloria Anzaldúa sense, as far as like borderlands, right? Being in this like space where it's kind of undefined, and sort of thinking about it beyond like binaries, right? Like why does it have to be quantitative and qualitative? Because there's a lot of in between, right? And it doesn't have to just be one or the other, or a mixture of just the two, quantitative and qualitative, right? There's lots and lots of different ways that we can bring methods together. So yeah, I that's a newer idea. I'm still sort of thinking about that. Like, what does it actually look like to be in the border, right? In the borderlands, right? And like sort of in that choke, as Gloria Anzaldo will call it, where you're constantly in tension. But I think methods are constantly in tension. But at the same time, we have to resolve those tensions and bring them together a lot of times in order to have more rigorous and research that answers the questions you want, right? Like you have to embrace those chokas and recognize that there's going to be tensions and they're not always going to be pretty. Epistemologically and theoretically, they don't actually always go really well together, and that's okay. So that's where I think I'm at.
Great.
Yeah, I really resonate with a lot of what Gina shared, that when I first started reading about mixed methods and trying to decide whether or not it was what I wanted to employ, I was really taken with how we talk about epistemology, particularly around mixed methods research, that oftentimes will pit positivism against constructivism, right? Like you're either at one end of the continuum or the other end of the continuum. And the epistemology that undergirds mixed methods is pragmatism, which says that this dichotomy is really false, that there's so much fluidity along that path, that there's so much value in big T truths and little T truths, and like really wrestling with the complexity of understanding people's experiences and the relationship between experience and outcomes. So I really like that middle space, that troubling. I feel like mixed methods, the simple way I think about it is, how we bring together some form of quantitative methodology and some form of qualitative methodology to understand very complex problems and complex experiences. And that doesn't mean that the quantitative methods have to look one way or that the qualitative methods need to look one way. It's really just how are you using different tools and strategies to really get at the root of understanding the problems and the issues that we continue to face in education. So yeah, it does allow you to play in this really interesting middle space where there's no dichotomies, where you're doing what works and what ultimately is going to translate to solutions, which I really enjoy.
I love that sort of piece about sort of unpacking this as both borderland, but also very solution focused, and getting however the question or the issue needs to be sort of like solved, using all the capacity that's available to us in order to inform that. I think that's one of the major things that I see as such a benefit to mixed methods research. Sort of taking this to the sort of next level, perhaps, and sort of helping to unpack some of this. I'm thinking maybe we could move to the question about tell us about a mixed method study that you have been investigating. And so could you talk about sort of the larger research question and then how you sort of drill down in terms of design and implementation around that study? And Kimberly, maybe if you want to go first on this one.
Sure. So I think often in terms of projects being mixed methods projects, right? Like, and ultimately what you may write out of that project may be a qualitative piece or a quantitative piece or even a mixed methods piece. But if I'm trying to understand a problem in a very comprehensive sense, how can I leverage all these different tools to make meaning of that problem? So I'll talk about the most recent project that I've done that's been a mixed methods project. We call it the STEM PhD Careers Project. And we were trying to get a better understanding of how biomedical scientists made decisions about whether they did or didn't want to be academics. Did they want to enter the faculty, with specific attention to issues of identity and how that might influence training and career development. So just understanding the general pattern of, we didn't know how anybody made decisions about whether or not they'd like to be faculty, but then, noticing different patterns in terms of who has access to the professoriate and who doesn't, instead of having the assumption that there is something, wrong with women, there's something wrong with men of color in terms of how they're navigating these pathways that make them less competitive. Are they very competitive at the end, and do they actively choose not to pursue these pathways? And what's making them choose one way versus another? So ultimately, when we started the project, I collaborate with a scientist, Dr. Kenneth Gibbs, and it was really interesting, particularly from an epistemological standpoint, to work with someone who was, I would say, very positivistic initially, and then probably moved to be more post-positivistic. but had a very strong investment in numbers, improving and being able to show in really meaningful ways cause and effect. But the questions that we were ultimately asking were very qualitative, that we wanted to know people's stories and narratives and how they subjectively saw the world. So how do we bring those together ultimately became this mixed method study. We started with focus groups, because we really, again, had no sense of how anybody, regardless of identity, was making decisions about, whether or not they wanted to do postdoctoral training, whether or not they wanted to be faculty, how they talked about their relationships with their advisors, and how that kind of played into that whole process. So we did focus groups with folks first, and did some writing based on those focus groups, and ultimately used the data we collected there to develop an instrument which we administered as broadly as we could, and ultimately got about 1,800 people to respond to. And then after that, really looked at people's data and looked at how they talked or checked, I guess, checked different boxes about how they thought about their career development at different points in time. So we asked them what they thought they wanted to be when they started graduate school, at the end of graduate school, and currently. And based on some of those patterns, we identified another group of people that we wanted to do interviews with. So we ended up conducting about 70 in-depth interviews with folks ranging from about an hour to 2 hours, really tracking each stage of their training, what their training experiences were like, and how they made decisions. So we can compare something very specific and quantitative, like, you said that at the end of graduate school, you were no longer interested in being a faculty member. Is that true? Do you still think that's true? On a scale of 1 to 5, you rated your relationship with your advisor as this. Tell me about that. What does that mean? What does that look like? So I think by doing this work, we were really able to unpack some of the hows and whys. It's very powerful to be able to see numbers and how the percentage of people who indicate high levels of interest in various career paths changes over time. But the qualitative work is really helping us get a deeper understanding of what training experiences ultimately led to those changes, and how women might be talking about those experiences different than men, and how people of color might be talking about those experiences in ways that are different from some of our white participants. So we really found it valuable to be able to see both the narratives and the quantitative data, particularly as we start thinking about how to present that to lots of different audiences.
That's great.
Yeah. So I would say I think about mixed methods along a project as well. I think obviously, we spend a lot of time doing research, so it becomes project, right? As opposed to like one paper or one, thing. And so I'll talk a little bit about my current project, but even as you were talking, Kim, I was thinking like, oh, how did I even get to where I'm at, right? Like it didn't just come out of nowhere, right? Like there was progression. So my project is right now is based in Chicago. I'm doing a multiple case study project in Chicago, and HSIs in Chicago. And I think by definition, case studies are mixed methods, because you have to bring in lots and lots of methods into case studies. But the way I came to choose actually the Midwest, because that's a newer area for us to think about HSIs. HSIs, a lot of the research has been done largely in California and Texas. And so I came to that by doing a project using secondary HARI data, SERP data, Cooperative Institutional Research Program. Me and a colleague, we did a project on emerging HSIs using secondary data through SERP. And one of the institutions was in the Midwest. And that was the first time I had really thought about HSIs in the Midwest, right? Because there's just not as common there. And so doing that got me thinking a lot about like, what do we not know about these institutions, right? And we had multiple institutions, and there was only one in the Midwest. And so that got me thinking a lot about the fact that there needed to be more work in the Midwest, right, on looking at HSIs in the Midwest, because it hasn't been done. And maybe HSIs in the Midwest are different than HSIs in anywhere else, right? Like in like I said, largely California and Texas, our knowledge base on HSIs is largely in those places. But we know there's differences geographically, and also Latinos are different in different places, right? Very different. So that means the institutions are likely to be different as well, just because the students are different. And so that's what got me to even start thinking about that area, because I probably wouldn't have without doing that study, right, which was secondary quantitative analysis. We did some regression analysis and found some interesting things, but it got me thinking a lot about what I wanted to look at with this project. So I have 3 institutions in my case study, and I pull all sorts of data. Before I chose the cases, I actually pulled IPEDS data. So I got secondary quantitative data through IPEDS, the institutional, post-secondary educational data system? No, integrated. Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm going to mess up. Integrated post-secondary educational data system. So I pulled data from there on all the 4-year HSIs in Chicago. And there wasn't that many. There was only 6. So it didn't, I pulled a lot of data from iPads, but I dug into those data first, before I chose my institutions, right? So it was very strategic in how I was choosing them, and I wanted them to be different enough, right? So I had the same context, the Midwest in Chicago, right? This one city, but different institutions in this same context to understand, well, how are these institutions that are potentially down the street from each other, operating differently, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of differences in the iPad data, lots and lots of differences across the 6 institutions. There were many ways I could have chose the institutions. And so I picked 3. Ultimately, I ended up going with 3. Actually, one institution didn't allow me to go, and they didn't let me collect data there, so I had to do a backup. But the quantitative data led a lot of my thinking, right, into the qualitative work before I started conducting interviews and then collecting documents and more secondary data. I guess it's not really, I don't know what you call documents. Whatever you would call them, if anybody wants to jump in with that. I guess secondary data. Yeah. But documents, right? Like pulling the institution's documents, and starting to look at what the kind of stuff that they were producing, reports and all that sort of stuff. I dug into that, right? Before I even stepped foot on the campuses. I had a student that wanted to do a historical analysis. So he took one of the institutions and went into the archives at one of the institutions and pulled a bunch of historical data, right? And that became a part of the project, right? And I was lucky that he wanted to do that work. And I'm like, sure, can you do it on this one institution? And I'll help you figure out what that looks like. But it will help the project, the bigger project. Eventually got to interviewing folks and to stepping foot on the campus, doing a lot of ethnographic type of work. Actually, I'm visiting one of my campuses in 2 weeks. And not going to interview anybody. I'm just going to go experience the campus for a couple days and just spend time. And we go and we take pictures and we journal and we just want to know what it feels like to be, there in the city on the campus, and what students feel, right, when they're on those campuses. So very long, it's longitudinal. It takes a long time to do all this collection. But along the way, there's all these different types of methods, right? And all these different types of data that are all valuable and becoming valuable as I'm starting to write. I'm just now getting into the writing 2 years later, and starting to think about how I'm going to use each of the data pieces, right? And some will use all of it and some they won't, right? I might only use like one piece of the data. So yeah, that's
great. I really appreciate sort of like the ways that you're talking about this in terms of project, not just a study, right? And I think oftentimes when we, especially for beginning sort of master's students, when you're first starting about research, I think everything in a textbook sort of defines it in, you're doing it for this project and for this thesis or this sort of piece. But I think the ways in which you're framing it, it makes so much more sense of like, no, this is an ongoing piece, and you're gonna have multiple pieces that come from different data sources, and using it in that way. I think that's so much more helpful to sort of frame it as a larger project, and then you're determining some of those things. Yeah. Gina, you were talking about sort of the progression that you've made over time, right? In terms of like when you first started out as maybe like a sort of like early career scholar, and then sort of to where you are now and using these mixed methods approaches. What has that progression sort of looked like for you? How did you think about it then versus now? Can you talk?
Sure. Yeah. That's a good question. I think that, so I was trained at the Higher Education Research Institute as a quantitative researcher. I was actually, first I'll shout out Maryland, the University of Maryland. I was trained as a quantitative researcher at the University of Maryland, right? At the time, we couldn't, if we wanted to do a master's thesis, it was quantitative only, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Dan, you remember that?
Yep.
You couldn't do qualitative master's theses at the time because there wasn't enough room in the curriculum to learn qualitative methods. I guess. I don't know. I guess that's what we were told, right? So I was trained as a quantitative researcher at that time. And that's all I knew, right? And then I went to Harry, went to UCLA, and worked at the Higher Education Research Institute, which is largely a quantitative research space, right? And so I was, that's where my mind was at, right? That's how I thought, right? I thought very much, once I got to Harry, very much about large data sets, right? And then also once I got to Harry, about secondary data, right? At Maryland, I collected my own data, right? My little small 300 people quantitative survey, and it was fine, right, for my master's thesis. But once I got to Harry, it was like, no, you need like 30,000. You need an N of 30,000 if you want to have infinite power, statistical power. And I'm like, oh, okay. I got that. I'll keep that. Note to self, right? And so very much trained in that sort of space, and that's all I knew. But once I started asking questions for my own research, they weren't quantitative questions. They were qualitative questions, right? Like I couldn't really answer these questions quantitatively. And I did some early work on HSIs using quantitative data, and I just didn't. For me, it felt very deficit. Right, the stuff I was finding was like, well, HSIs are no good, right? And that was what was coming out of Harry, was every time we put an HSI variable in a model, it was always negatively related to something, right? There was never anything positive. We could never say anything positive. The HSI variable somehow would create like, well, the people who go to HSIs have lower whatever we're looking at, right? And that there's value placed on that, right? And so I didn't like that. Like, I'm like, well, maybe we need to dig deeper, right? Maybe the quantitative data is just not showing us what we really need to look at, right, at a deeper level. And I didn't want to do deficit work on HSIs, right? Like I was like, these spaces are important, and we need to figure out what it is that's good about them, right? Yeah, sure, they need some help, and all institutions do, right? Like all institutions, we need to look deeply and figure out how to be better, right? All institutions can be better, but I just didn't want to do deficit work, and so I was asking questions that were more, I guess, qualitative, right? And so I started leaning that direction of like, well, maybe I need to dig in, and I need to just start talking to people and go into these spaces and figuring it out and framing the research differently than the way I could with the secondary data, right? Because the secondary data was going to continue to give me the same sort of things. And so, yeah, at some point I became much more embedded in the qualitative research. And now, as I describe my project, I have all of it. Like I kind of have all of it going on. And as I'm thinking about my next project and a grant I'm applying for, I want to use quasi-experimental analysis to compare some of my own data that I collect, quantitative data, on the ground at the classroom level, which I thought about, like, could I use secondary data with Harry? And for this project, I can't actually. I need to get into the classroom. I need to collect my own data because it's classroom level sort of questions that I'm asking. And so, yeah, it just continues to progress, in all sorts of different ways, in ways that I couldn't have really predicted when I first originally started out, I guess, early as a master's student, right? Thinking about research way back then when I was first starting.
Sure. Yeah. Kimberly, thinking about, your own progression as a scholar and as a researcher, what's shifted or evolved over time for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first I'll say, though, Maryland students now do qualitative master's theses.
I know you do now. I know. That's why I said back when Dan and I were there.
Yes, but we made some adjustments. We made some progress. So we got the qualitative master's thesis.
All right. Nice. Good job.
But thank you. I would say that the way that I think about projects and the array of mixed methods work you can do has really evolved, right? So I remember thinking about designing my dissertation, and I was trained in the same place is Gina. I went to UCLA, that if you were going to do a mixed method study, more than likely you were going to take Harry data. And then you were going to do qualitative analysis with it. And that's what you were going to do. You would run a quantitative analysis, and then you would do interviews, and you would kind of try to bring it together and say something meaningful. And that's what mixed methods work was in my head. Even though I had read all these books that talked about all the other ways that you could do it, that it was, and my pushback was that I was going to do a high level, complicated quantitative analysis along with a very deep, rich qualitative analysis. I wasn't going to just like skirt the edges of what was meaningful to me in terms of my qualitative work, that I really was going to do these in-depth interviews, and that the way that mixed methods researchers talk about their designs is it a big quant or a little quant, or a big qual or a little qual? And I wanted them both to be big. Like there's gonna be a big quant and a big qual. I think over time what I've learned is that you can learn just as much from a little quant, big qual, big quant, little qual. Like it really depends on your question and what you really want to know. And that sometimes, the quantitative work helps you identify the sample or a group of people that you want to focus more on, or you do a quantitative study and you have, a small section where you have people offer qualitative insights, and that's enough. It doesn't have to be something huge and expansive and complicated. I don't know that I always thought in terms of projects either. I remember my first year after completing my dissertation, trying to write these really long, complicated mixed methods papers that were really, really difficult and really long. And when I tried to shorten them, I wasn't doing anything well, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So I remember sitting down and having a long talk with Paul Umbach, I remember at AERA, and he's like, I so understand what you were trying to do in this paper. Here's why you need to break them. And there needs to be a quantitative paper and a qualitative paper. And it was really hard to let go of the fact that I wanted to do this mixed methods work. But I think I was able to maintain my identity as a mixed methods researcher and do qualitative papers and quantitative papers and think in terms of mixed methods projects. I think that was one of the biggest transformations for me and my maturity as a researcher, that I didn't have to let other people define what kind of work or what kind of scholar I was based on what I was putting out in the world. It was how I thought about my work. And that I think in terms of mixed methods problems, that I designed the study around what my question is. And just like Gina said, like sometimes I have qualitative questions. Sometimes the existing data set doesn't get at what I want to know in the way that I want to know it. So I have to do the qualitative work first and then design the instrument. I think I just see it more fluidly and as a more complicated endeavor to go into, rather than there's one way to do it and this is the way, and that means you have to publish a mixed methods paper from it, and otherwise you're not really a mixed methods researcher, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. And I feel like we're starting to get into sort of the next question, which is sort of what do you see as the advantages or disadvantages of sort of approaching research from a mixed methods sort of perspective, especially in education settings. And so I think you've started to name some of the sort of like, even just writing about it, it becomes a huge struggle, right? Right?
Ooh, I have very few mixed methods papers out in the world. Mm-hmm. And I can think of one where I ran a quantitative analysis and there was one significant relationship that was interesting to me. And I was like, this relationship right here, I want to unpack this relationship. So I'm going to have qualitative data that further explores why these two variables are related to each other. But not to scare or overwhelm anybody, but my dissertation had 4 findings chapters because there was just so much to say. And I think one of the challenges with mixed methods work is that what's really meaningful is when you bring the data together and have it speak to each other. Mm. And doing that is messy and just takes a long time. There is a lot to say. And so it's not a matter of like, I don't know, figuring out how to write it was a little bit challenging, but it was just like, I have so many pages to write because I have so much to say about what's coming from my data. And I think that's challenging. Finding homes for that kind of work is challenging. Feeling like you are a good enough, quote unquote, good enough quantitative researcher and a good enough qualitative researcher to do the work and do it well, I think can also be challenging. Of course, there are ways around all of these things, but if we're talking about challenges, those are some of them. I think benefits are that it really gives you this deep, meaningful understanding of really complex problems. It gives you a really interesting opportunity to even challenge yourself or figure out contradictory findings or things that are unexpected. I love knowing what's and why's, and it lets you know both at the same time. In some really interesting ways. So I think those to me are just some quick challenges and benefits.
That's great. Mm-hmm. Gina, any others that come to mind?
I mean, I guess I'll start with the benefits. I think it's more fun, right? Like, it's just like, I don't know, like we get to ask questions that any question, I can ask any question I want. And I, I don't feel confined to like one sort of thing, right? Like I said, like this project I'm thinking about right now, like a week ago, I wasn't like, oh, I'm a quasi-experimental researcher. I don't even know what that is. I did mention that earlier because now I know all the folks who do quasi-experimental work in higher ed because I'm learning about all of them because I'm like, okay, who does this work, right? But like, that's what the project is, and that's the best approach to answer this question that I have, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's go, right? And it's fun and it's exciting, trying to learn new methods and trying to learn new things. And, it's a small piece of the larger project, right? And so I think it's fun, right? It's fun to go to think about it as a big thing. And then just approach it in all sorts of ways. So I think that's the biggest benefit, right? Of living in the borderlands, right? To go back to my analogy of the borderlands is that it's just a fun space that I'm not like, oh, I can only do this because this is all I do. Like, let's go. Let's try something new, right? Like, and it's fun to have a research team and they each have different, Bill, like I said, I had a grad student and he wanted to do historical analysis. And I'm like, okay, I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to connect you to somebody that does. That's number one. I have friends. She'll help us, right? And she did. And then let's do it, right? And we're going to use those data, and those data are an important part of my project. That if I didn't have a grad student to do some of that work, I probably wouldn't have got those data, right? So it's fun. Yeah, the challenge, of course, is just hard to bring it together. I think also, so in reality, we have to be real that epistemologically, sometimes things contradict each other, right? It's hard to bring them together, right? But I think that's part of the fun, right? Going back to the fun of like, is trying to figure out, well, like, how can we resolve this, right? That like, everything doesn't have to be so pretty and doesn't have to like all come together pretty in order to answer this bigger, important question, right? We can still answer questions and solve problems in education, even if our epistemologies don't completely 100% match or align, right? They can come together. We're complex people and we're answering complex problems. So yeah, that's challenging. And sometimes external reviewers don't like that, but that's that. If you can convince them, then you can live in the borderline, right? You can live in the choke. You can live in that tension space. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe this is sort of a good segue into, like one of the things that I recognize too, from the both of you, you do bring not often, I think all the time, a critical lens to the work too, right? So I'm thinking about, Kimberly, like your work with your piece on intersectionality and mixed methods, which to me was like, yes, like when I read it for the first time, like this is what I love to see of this being brought into sort of a mixed methods approach, right? And Gina, you're talking about not wanting to do deficit-based work and the decolonization work that you're doing with HSIs, like all of those things. And so do you see that like there's a space to do, how do I want to put this? Do you see a sort of maybe a connection between sort of identity work, criticality, and mixed methods approaches that is sort of even more emerging in the field right now around solving these problems of educational institutions and contexts and issues in those ways?
Yeah, I think that having a critical eye for me means like it just kind of not taking things at face value, right? Which particularly can be a problem when you're doing quantitative work, that, you run an analysis and you're like, oh, there's a significant difference or there's not a significant difference. And you're not necessarily thinking about like, how are you disaggregating? How are you breaking data apart You know, what are you looking for, or what are you not looking for, right? So the example that I often use is for my dissertation, I studied Black faculty members and their relationships with students and how they were thinking about service and all these things. And I am certain there's a line in my dissertation that says something like, there are no gender differences really of note here, right? Because any analysis I ran, gender in it was not a significant predictor, right? Shame on me. So I go back later, and I think one of the things that came out of Gina's comments earlier that I think bears repeating and reiterating is that mixed methods work benefits so much from a team. Because, you know, I had my students look at my qualitative data and they're like, the way that women are talking about things is fundamentally different from the way that men are talking about things. That, you know, as Black faculty members, they talk about more of a burden, but the words and the language and the ways that women are taking on this burden looks very different from how faculty members are. So even in going back to the quantitative data, noting that like, okay, but you know, I broke down how many hours a week faculty members were spending with students by gender. I didn't look at how much stress they experienced or they reported experiencing because of those experiences, right? So it wasn't just like a number of hours per week, but how much stress did they say they experienced from committee work? How much stress did they say they experienced from engaging with their colleagues? And women reported more stress from those experiences, right? So that bouncing back and forth between qualitative and quantitative really allowed me to be more thoughtful about my quantitative analysis and how could I use what tools I had in front of me to really get a deeper understanding of where those differences might actually be and where they might show up in quantitative work, all based on like how you disaggregate data. So I think for me, it just kind of really spoke to the importance of remembering to be critical when we look at quantitative work and that there's no objective, oh, significant, not significant, true, not true. All depends on how you ask the question and how you break the data apart.
That's great.
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, definitely as far as like, like I mentioned, I felt a little bit confined by the quantitative, right? To be able to apply the critical lens. I don't think I completely 100% think that's the case, right? Like I think you can be very critical in quantitative work, right? And I think that needs to be done. I think it's hard work, right? I think it's very, very hard work to like lay that critical lens on because the data do tell us certain things. But the way we interpret it, I think it matters, right? And we have to realize that, right? Like I think when I read the book, what is it? White Methods, White Logic. I don't know if y'all read that, critical race sort of approach to methods and really shedding light on the fact why methods are so white, right? Why they've been so white and why the way we interpret them are so white. Like that was just really powerful to be like, yeah, like quantitative work, it's like, it's just the way we're seeing the world, right? Like, and it's not objective. It's not objective in any sort of way, right? And you can do different things with data, quantitative and qualitative data, to find answers that look different based on your lens, right? And your approach. Not that you're tweaking the data in bad ways or anything, right? But like you can reframe it, right? The way you reframe it to see it from your lens, I think it matters. So for me, I go at it now just very much from a theoretical space, right? Like my lens is always this theory, right? It's always going to be critical. It's always, you know, I often will identify myself as a critical race theorist, but really not. Like I'm not like one who's like, I haven't done theoretical work. I haven't written like deep theoretical stuff. But I would say I'm a critical race theorist in that like I see the world as very racialized, right? And so the way I approach research and the way I approach my analysis and all this sort of stuff, there's always a racial lens, always, right? Like I always view the world from that perspective, and from very much a systems-based oppression type of model, right? Of like, well, what's going on at these different levels, right? That would make these that we would see these different outcomes and whatnot. So yeah, I think once you just realize that like your lens is your lens, right? Like the work is always going to be, you know, like critical. The way you ask questions, the way you answer questions, it's always going to be from that sort of critical perspective.
Yeah.
It just leads you to have a certain set of assumptions, right? Like, and if, let's say there isn't a significant relationship between something that, you know, based on my assumptions, racism is a thing, sexism is a thing, right? Like, and if I'm not seeing it, like, the response isn't to just let it go. It's like, okay, so what am I missing? Because this is a thing, right? Like, you know, maybe I need to look at the qualitative data. Maybe it's an indirect relationship. So I think it pushes you to continue to look, not in a way that you're, again, trying to change the data. Data's data. But am I missing something? Because this should be showing up if all the things that I believe, as somebody who thinks, critical race theory is a really valuable lens, that critical studies generally are really, really valuable tools. How am I, like, if those are my assumptions, how am I checking and rechecking to make sure that I haven't missed anything?
I appreciate that a lot. I think for me, one of the things that I notice, especially with, sometimes in my student development theory class, I'll often have students read sort of pieces around sort of like emerging scholarship. And oftentimes as new grad students, they're reading qualitative work and sort of critiquing it. Well, this is just 20 students or 10 students. And so there's more manipulation potentially of what the qualitative researcher is saying than if you were reading something that's quantitative and has, an N of 2,000 students, and that there's this sort of notion that that's not that can't be manipulated, that those are statistics, right? And so to me, I'm always sort of like, I guess my soapbox has become positionality and reflexivity in terms of all research across the board, and that like even quantitative researchers need to be sort of addressing that because their worldview is interpreting what they're sort of looking at. And so do you find that those are important aspects to your work? And if so, how do you sort of think about sort of your own positionality and reflexivity when you're looking at data and doing data analysis?
I'll go first, I guess, this time. Absolutely, right? That I think the more I do research, the more that I realize that my whole being and my whole life, everything is embedded in the research, right? Like the way I ask questions, the way I approach it, the way I analyze it, it's my worldview. It's based on my worldview, right? And so I think recognizing that is important, obviously. But then also, what do you do with that, right? Like, so I think the first step in realizing like, oh, this is important. It's like, okay, here's who I am as a person. And here's why, why I see the world the way it is. But it's like, okay, but how do you move past that? How do we move past it, right? So I guess I'm at that point of like, okay, so how do I check that and make sure that I still am seeing the data from multiple viewpoints, right, or different vantage points, because my worldview isn't the only one, right, and it's going to be interpreted in different ways. And I think there is, going back to the value of like multiple people on research teams and stuff. I know obviously for grad students that's a little harder when you're doing your own work initially. But yeah, I'm at a point, and obviously Kim is at a point where we can have multiple people come in and be like, all right, let's bring in different vantage points. And how are you seeing the data? How am I seeing the data? How are, and let's compare, right? And sort of check ourselves and like bringing in those multiple perspectives. I think also, I know with qualitative research where it's like, let's do member checking. And I think there's value in that, but it's hard to do. Right. And so I'm trying to think about rethinking that, like, what does that look like now? Right. Like with my project now, I'm actually I get to spend more time with the folks. And so going back in, and now they're bringing me back in to do presentations and talks based on what I'm finding. Right. And then they get to give feedback at that point. Right. As opposed to me being like, can you read this, like, chapter that I wrote and give me feedback? Like, nobody's gonna do that, right? Like, your member checking is hard, right? Like, very few people. I've been asked to do member check, and I'm like, yeah, I don't have time to read this. Like, yeah, it looks fine. I'm okay. So it's hard, right? So you have to think, what are we asking folks to actually do, and how do we approach it in a different way, right? And so for me, that's like, okay, that's a different way that I can do it, right? Rather than saying, can you do this? But like, hey, I'm gonna tell you what I found, and I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna do some professional development with your folks if you let me, right? Like with your faculty, and talk about these findings and how y'all can use it. And so I think that's important, right? So that then they have the opportunity to like give feedback and agree or disagree. And because I doesn't mean I I'm not necessarily interpreting it the way they meant it, right? And so they can give me that feedback at that point. So I think there's a lot of different ways for us to check it. But beyond just recognizing it, right? Like, I think that's the first step of like, yep, I see the world from my view, and here's my view, and leaving it at that, because I see my doc students do that, right? It's like, here's my positionality statement, and then that's it. Mm-hmm. And then I'm like, no, you got to go carry that further, right? Like, now what are you going to do with that information, and how are you going to make sure you're checking your biases, right? Because we all have biases. So.
Yeah, I really resonate with so much that Gina shared. I think in terms of, making sure that your work is an authentic reflection of what was shared with you, I think some of the best feedback that I'm getting now are the things that make me feel like I'm getting it right is when I present my data and somebody says, you're telling my story. Or when someone sends an email and says like, hey, what you wrote really speaks to my experience. That for me is, and it takes a long time to get that, but I think that for me tells me that I'm getting close to getting it right, or at least getting it right for somebody. So I often ask folks, and I often say I actually have a mirror in my office, because I used to say it so much, that research is me search, right? That we all have these personal connections to our studies. That if you ask me about just about any project that I've done, there is some personal way that I connect to that story. There's something meaningful that's happened in my life or that I've seen that's made me interested in that. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that that's what makes us excited about our work. It's what makes us passionate about our work. It's where the interest came from, right? So I don't think that that's anything that we ever have to be ashamed of. But I think much like Gina said, like, you have to acknowledge it, right? Like, you have to see it and talk about it. And I find that memoing is for me the best way to do that. That I memo throughout my research process, not so much as sometimes as data in and of itself, but mostly in terms of data analysis. And particularly when I memo right after I collect data, it's my honest first impression of what happened. So not only like, what did people say, but like, how do I feel right now? Do I feel uncomfortable? Did I really enjoy that interview because it really clicked on a lot of things that I already thought? Did I feel really frustrated because somebody wasn't sharing in the way that I expected them to? How is what was shared challenging assumptions that I had, and being very upfront about that and how I'm wrestling with those assumptions? I think that that's really important. And then also looking for disconfirming evidence. So we all have in the back of our head the way that we think the story goes, or if we map out like a simple framework of like, okay, so this is what I think I see evolving from my data. Really taking a look through your data to see like, who doesn't fit into this story? Who doesn't fit into this pattern, really to challenge how much of myself am I projecting on other people, and how much of this is actually folks' stories. I think, Gina, your point as well about having people not only write a positionality statement, and like, so this is who I am, and what happens now. So you've now acknowledged all your stuff, right? We all carry around a backpack full of stuff. You told me what's in there, so what are you going to do with it now? How are you then going to be mindful about making sure that you're not just seeing the data as a reflection of your own experience, but as an authentic reflection of the experience of your participants, whether it be qualitative or quantitative, or trying to do mixed methods analysis?
That's great. I love this. And I love the fact that you're also naming some really important steps across the board. I think for all researchers, whether you're going to do quantitative work, qual, or a sort of a mixed methods approach, action research, like that memoing, that journaling, that taking the positionality statement and thinking further than, just who am I, what does this mean? But like, how does this affect the work that I'm going to be doing? And thinking about identity work, I think for us, like that's a big piece that we're trying to have our students really, really grapple with and understand. So I really appreciate that. I wanted to sort of, there's a little connection of this, but I think asking you all the question of what are some of the ethical issues you experience when it comes to approaching mixed methods projects? What are the things that come to mind for you in terms of ethical responsibility or things to consider?
I don't know if it's specific to mixed methods projects, but particularly because I'm studying, if I'm thinking about the STEM PhD career study, right? So oftentimes we're talking to biomedical scientists of color. So we're talking about, small numbers. We were able to talk to, for example, let's say 8 Native American biomedical scientists. If I tell you too much about them, you know exactly who I'm talking about, or people in their field would know exactly who we're talking about. So how do we dig deep with people? How do we really get understandings of the nuances of their experiences without, you know, disclosing too much, without that person in the sense like revealing who they are in an environment that may not be so welcoming to the things that they have to say. I think that that's probably the thing that's most pressing at the front of my mind right now. It's like, how do we tell these folks' stories in a way that's, you know, detailed and compelling, so people know that like I actually do have an interview with this person, but without telling too much to put them or their career at risk. How do I not reduce somebody to a number or a narrative? That these are rich, complex stories and real lives. And, you know, I don't want to toy with people's lives. So how do I not just see them as some way for me to tell a story that's interesting to somebody and, you know, advance my own career? Like, how am I actually working towards addressing whatever issues folks are facing in that field, right? Like, I do this work because it's interesting, but ultimately I think there's an issue with biomedical training. So, you know, to what extent am I not just, you know, publishing papers in the Journal of Higher Ed? Am I thinking about speaking at NIH? Am I thinking about speaking in front of NSF? Am I thinking about going to different campuses, even when that's uncomfortable?
So, I mean, similar sort of response as far as ethical issues. For me, though, because like I said, I study organizations, right? So I talk to people within organizations, but I write at the organizational level. I recently had to think a lot about what it meant to anonymize my institutions, because I'm actually writing a book, and I got feedback from the book reviewers, and one of them was very concerned with like, if I really wanted to figure out your institutions, I could. And you absolutely could. It's not hard to figure out the HSIs in Chicago. Right? Like, there's only a handful. If you really want to dig, everybody can figure them out, right? And the people from Chicago don't have to dig very hard. They're like, because I gave a presentation, and the people from Chicago in that room, it was at a conference for HSI educators. They were like, oh, is it such and such? Oh, is it such and such? Like, they knew, right? They knew which institution it was. And so I talked with I had a mentor who I spoke with about that, about what does that mean? And, you know, I was kind of frustrated, like, why is this a problem? Like, I'm doing as much as I can, right? I'm being as ethical as I can. And, you know, she talked to me about like, so if you say something, and this institution tries to get like a grant, let's say, right? At an institutional level, they're trying to do something. And they, you know, the grantors or whoever figures out that your book is about that, and, you know, institution, and they use it against them. Like, it's deep ethical issues, right? And I'm like, oh my God, right? It's beyond people's life, one person's life. It's like everybody's life. It's the entire institution, right? And I think of the institution as a life form, right? Like that life. I am potentially affecting that life, right? Which is the institution's life, which for HSIs is a very delicate life for the most part, right? They're delicate institutions, and I don't want to harm them. Right? This is the last thing. I actually want to advocate for them in every sort of way, right? And it sounds like that's what you're saying as well, Kimberly. Like, you're trying to advocate for these people. You're not trying to harm them, but people use research against you, and that's very, very real, right? People, that happens. Other folks that are thinking about things differently than you are, right? And so that was hard. That's hard for me, and I'm actually still grappling with it, because I don't think I fully have resolved it, of how I'm going to protect these institutions. And also, there's value in doing case studies, like me giving a tremendous amount of detail about these institutions, right? Like, we want to know about these institutions. People, the more detail I give, I'm telling these really important stories. We want details about this, right? Y'all gonna read the book and be like, tell us more, Gina. Tell us more about this institution and why it's amazing in these sort of ways you laid out, right? So we can learn from it, right? Like, but I think of y'all and y'all watching as wanting to learn from, right? And not wanting to do harm to these institutions. But there are folks who could want to do that. So I wish I had a good answer to say that I've resolved it, but I haven't. But I'm having to think about it a lot more than I've had to before.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So switching gears slightly, and I think we've touched on this in different aspects, but I do want to ask the question directly and have this as an explicit conversation. So going to the question, why might some people argue that there's no such thing as mixed methods? What are your thoughts on that?
So I will think about every argument I've heard when a student says, I want to do a mixed methods dissertation. And ultimately someone goes like, so you want to do two, right? Like you want to have or if somebody does a mixed method study, they'll be like, well, here's the quantitative question, here's the qualitative question. That so often when folks do mixed methods, they have like separate analyses or separate interpretations, that really the beauty in mixed methods is bringing things together to have a deeper understanding. So I think ultimately that's one of the main reasons that so often we keep everything so separate. And I think for me, it's always been important that, again, while I've published qualitative work and quantitative work off of different studies, that I've really thought about the design of the study and what I want to know in a very complex way, so that ultimately, in the end, I'll have a very complex, multi-mixed methods understanding of a problem. But I can see why people would say that, there's no such thing as really mixing, because people often don't do the mixing.
I agree. I think also probably that argument is flawed, and that probably some people who have said that actually do mixed methods research also, right? Like without realizing it, because I think it takes you a while to realize that you're doing, right? Like doing this kind of work, right? These questions that you've asked us and that we're really thinking pretty deeply here, right? We're thinking about a longitudinal sort of like these long projects and big ideas, and this project led to that one, but that one was important for this one, right? Like they're continuing to be connected and all that sort of things. I think it takes a while to get to that, right? I wouldn't have called myself a mixed methods researcher, when I first started doing research. I was very much in this very like compartmentalized, like sort of like, oh, I just do this one type of research. So I think it takes time to get to that point, right? Where you realize like, oh, this is mixing, right? Like, but I think that part of that is getting beyond that binary, right? Because when I first was exposed to the idea of mixed methods, it wasn't a binary. But like there's this quantitative and there's this qualitative, and you mush them together, right? And there's these three ways you can do it, right? Like it's very like, so when I've read mixed methods books and articles, like the journal, like of mixed methods research and stuff, I think it's a very positivist approach, right? It's still very like chug, like do this, then do this, then do this, right? Like there's all this sort of like do it very specifically, and then it's rigorous, and then it's mixed methods, right? Like, and so that has been interesting to me in learning how to do mixed methods and learning from all those different books and those researchers who have done it, but then also critiquing that and being like, this is very like positivist, right? Like, and you can go out and mix methods from a lot of different ways, and it doesn't have to be so like you do this and then this, and there's only 3 ways, or I don't know, maybe 5 ways, right? Like there's been like these very specific categories of like, mixed method, explanatory and exploratory, there's like these specific categories. And so I struggle with that too. I was like, well, I think it's more than that too, right? Like we gotta go beyond that, those sort of like very structured terms and ways of thinking about it. So yeah, I think it's just complex. So I think folks that say, no, it's not real, just haven't thought deeply about it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you feel the perception of a mixed methods approach as more difficult than a purely quantitative or qualitative approach is a misconception? Why or why not?
Oh gosh.
I know, that one's tough. Say it again, make sure I'm understanding it.
Sure. So do you feel that the perception of a mixed methods approach is more difficult than a purely quantitative or qualitative approach is a misconception? Why or why not?
I don't think it's a misconception. I think it's unfair to write it off or to think of it as like, well, that's just too hard, right? Mm-hmm. But it has all the challenges of doing good quantitative work and all the challenges of doing good qualitative work, right? And all the benefits of doing good qualitative and quantitative work. So I don't know if I don't know that I would compare my experiences doing mixed methods work and say, oh, well, my dissertation was harder than everybody else's because it was mixed methods. I don't know that I would describe it that way. I think it had a unique set of challenges that's different from folks who did qualitative studies and people who did quantitative studies. Yeah, I don't want to have, a hierarchy of, hardcoreness in your methods. It's just hard in a different way.
Yeah.
It's just hard in a different way.
I would say time, right? So there's different times, right? Like, so it could be very time consuming to do multiple methods, right? And I'm thinking about one of my grad students right now. Well, so I'll think about my mixed methods project actually. So I did mention I also have a photo elicitation portion, right? So I had students take pictures. I interviewed students after they take pictures. I asked them about the pictures. That has been a very time consuming portion of my project. I don't actually know what to do with all those data because I haven't spent enough time getting to know the method, right? I'm like, I thought it sounded like a good idea. And honestly, at some point I'm going to figure it out because there's some really interesting things coming on about the fact that students see the institution differently than I see it, right? Like, and they're giving me that. They're taking pictures of the institution. It's a very institutional study, right? And they're taking pictures of things, not people. And then giving me these complicated reasons of why they took these pictures, right? And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is way more complex. And I have to learn the method to really, really be able to do justice to those data. And so until I do, I'm just not going to deal with those data right now because I'm like, I can't, right? Because I have to really know what to do with those data, right? And so I had a student who was like, yeah, I want to do the pictures in my dissertation. I'm like, you realize we're not doing anything with those data in our project. And you see that because you were a part of the project because we haven't figured out that method well enough to be able to write about that or do something with it. Yet we will. And so you got 1 year. You need to get out of here in the next year. So do you have the time to learn that method really well and do it? Because if you do that method, I'm going to make you learn it. You're going to learn it. You're going to write about it in the methods chapter. You're going to do it well. You're going to analyze the data. You got to do it. You got to do it 100%. So if you're willing to take on that time commitment, right? So I don't see it as more or less rigorous, whether or not this person includes that or not in the dissertation. I'm just saying, hey, you got to commit. Commit to it and commit to learning and commit to doing it as well as anything else of the other pieces of your dissertation, right? And that's why I'm at, like with my project, I was like, hey, I didn't commit to learning that whole portion really well yet. I will, I promise, at some point. Or I'll have a grad student who's like, solve at it.
Yeah.
And I think part of it too is that I've been dying to teach a mixed methods course for so long, and that we oftentimes don't have opportunities to really learn how to do mixed methods in meaningful ways. It's harder to find opportunities to write mixed methods pieces. We don't have as many good examples of mixed methods work. So I think in that way it feels harder that there's no guidance on how to do it because some of it is so fluid and there's so many different choices you can make. I don't know exactly what my mixed methods course would look like, but again, just unique challenges associated with it, but there are some challenges associated with just a lack of consistent ways of teaching folks how to do that kind of work.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, I think it goes also back to what you both have been saying earlier too, right? So if you have a really complex question that you're trying to grapple with, I think oftentimes the complexity of then the methods that you have to use in order to solve that is also going to be at hand in terms of making that difficult, which is very different than if you have one qualitative question that you're doing around a narrative inquiry, or have a data set that you can run a regression analysis and sort of there's your so I think the complexity also may be a form at play here in terms of how you then have to answer it and all of the data. I mean, if you're using photo elicitation plus institutional data, and all of those different pieces, there's so much data that you have that sometimes you also, I can imagine, be inundated and sometimes also get paralysis of so what do I do with all of this data, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the feedback that we got on a grant proposal that we recently wrote, which was a large mixed methods project, was, what are you going to do with all this data? Right. We're like, we'll figure it out. We'll make sense of it later, right? We'll bring it together. But I mean, there's no guidebook to exactly how to do that. And it does end up amounting to an awful lot of data.
Right. I think for me, it's just like, I have the time, right? So like, I don't worry about it for me, right? Like I have these photos and I have these great interviews and I'm like, I have time, right? Like this is my long-term research project, right? So I have the time to figure it out, right? But yeah, like grantors, they don't want you to take like, I might not write something until 5 years from now, right? The grantors, they're like, could you like give us something? Yeah. We'll go give you the next phase of the money after you give us something, right? They want it, right? So you don't always have the luxury of the time, right? So and that's why I think going back to that, that's what my comment really was. It was like, that's what's complicated about it, is that it's just this time consuming, right? To collect a lot of data and to give it the time that it needs, right? To actually, because you could do like analysis at a very surface level and not really do good work, right? But or you can spend the time getting to know it and find some great things and come up with some great answers, I think.
Yeah, that's great. So moving into our final question, as students begin their work learning about mixed methods approaches in educational research, what advice would you give them to think about doing their own work on master's theses or even mixed method projects down the line?
Master students only?
Yeah, because most of the students that will be watching this will be master's students, but maybe doc students as well.
Yeah. Oh, well, they're going to be doc students eventually.
Exactly, yeah.
They'll eventually be there.
That's right.
Before I answer that, can you give us a little more context? Like, what do they do? Like your students from this class, like, what do they go on?
Yeah, so for our program at Cal Lutheran, our students have this research core sequence. This is Intro to Research Methods. So they're getting the sort of the broader overview. In the next semester, they start to work on chapter 2 and 3. So they start to sort of investigate a methodology around, well, at the end of 509, they start to identify their research question. So where they want to go next. In 510, they start to outline what's the existing literature say and start to write a lit review, and then start to figure out, based upon my question, what's the right methodology for me to use? And so starting to get into understanding and writing chapter 3. And then students who want to go on and do their thesis are then moving into the thesis course in the spring. Will they actually go through and collect their data and then analyze their data? So, these are counselor ed students who are either going to be K-12 school counselors or college counselors at community colleges and four-year universities and colleges. And so they approach all of this from very different strategies and different varying points, right? So some are going to do action research projects that are going to be very backyard research. I want to improve my work as a counselor. And others might be more interested in sort of, I have a data set, but now I want to sort of like use that data set and put it into practice, or do focus groups based around that and learn more. Like I was just meeting with a student who works in career services on campus. And so she has access to data from our 800 student employees who work at the university campus, and is thinking about using that. But then we've talked about, well, how could you unpack some of that with quantitative approaches, so that way you could create a true mixed methods sort of project, and sort of bring the statistics to life, share more of the story, get more information. So, it ranges, but those are some of the things that we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you. No, that's helpful, because I don't want to give advice that's like kind of out there that is not really going to be all that helpful.
Absolutely.
I think for me, I would say, it's a confined time, right? And we were just talking about time, is trying to figure out how best to utilize that time, right? Like, and I mean, I think I would give this advice to doctoral students, right? Like master's and doctoral students, that like, as you go through the program, think about the project in little pieces, right? Like, so for the class they're in right now, you said they're going to start conceptualizing, right? Like maybe there's a small piece, right? Like a pilot type of project. This is my 4-year-old. He's learning about mixed methods too. Like maybe there's a pilot project, right? And then it goes into the next thing, into the next thing. And I think it goes back to a lot of what we're talking about, like that we've been talking about our work as this long-term stuff. right? And that like one question leads to the next, you do one thing and you answer that question and then it becomes a new question, right? And so not thinking about it as like, okay, I have to do this project for this class and I have to do this one for this class and then I'm going to get into my big research project. Not really, right? Like those things can be leading into each other. So I think trying to be as strategic as you can, right? Like, and I mean, that's hard because that requires you to answer or to ask your question now, right? Like what the question now, which is, that's a big commitment, right? To say, this is the question I'm gonna answer and I'm gonna work with for the next 2 years, whatever it may be. But the more you can do that, right? I think the more that you can like, okay, let's think about it in small pieces along the way. I think it's helpful, and I think all my projects, they all started like one little thing leads to the next, the next, the next. So yeah.
That's great.
Such great advice. So I have 3 pieces of advice, and 2 of them are pretty like they speak to any research project, and then the last one is specific to mixed methods. So I'd say the first piece of advice was the advice I got when I was doing my master's thesis, and it was the first research project I ever was going to do, and I had grand dreams of how I was going to upend the field of higher education with my study, and I was told to focus on finding something interesting, that it is very hard to find something groundbreaking and earth-shattering in the process of learning to do research. So you're actually doing 2 things at one time. You're learning how to do research and you're also trying to find something interesting. So to be patient with yourself and realize that you're learning how to do research. So it's okay and actually really important to make mistakes and to be able to look back on this project and see all the ways that you've grown and all the things that you do different if you could do it again. The second thing I would say is to really be mindful of whether or not mixed methods is the best strategy to answer your question. And that's true of any methodology, that if you're thinking about doing a quantitative study, is that the best strategy to answer your question? If you're doing qualitative methods, is this the best strategy to answer your question? I think one of the questions I ask most frequently in thesis defenses, proposal defenses is, so what do you really want to know? And just really connecting to what you want to know and what will ultimately allow you to find the answer to that question is really important. And I think the third thing I would say is be thoughtful about that mixing part, right? Like, how are you really going to have one form of data inform the other? Is it that it's helping you identify a sample? Is it that it's helping you develop an instrument? Like, how are the pieces of data actually speaking to each other? Because that's really what takes mixed methods work to the next level, that it's not just, here's my quantitative section, here's my qualitative section. What do you now know that you couldn't have known before because you did both of these in the same study? How do these pieces of data speak to each other?
That's great. That's great advice from both of you. I really appreciate that. And I think, again, for our students, hopefully they'll start thinking about these things around how do you do this in practice? How do you conceptualize these things, and how do you put all of that into your practice as a researcher? So thank you so much for your time and your insights and sharing this with us today. I really appreciate it, and know that our students will definitely appreciate it as well. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.